Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, we have been working on this question of trying to back into how reliable is the Bible? Can we trust what's in the pages of it? How much credibility can we give it? And what evidence do we have to support it? Last week, we looked at this question of the telephone game and what a terrible analogy it is for how oral tradition was passed on. And before we jump into the question of how oral tradition was actually passed on, I thought it might be a good idea to maybe just take a step back before we get started. I think one of the mistakes, there's a couple mistakes I think people make when I listen to online criticism about the Bible. And one is this idea that, well, everybody who was born before the year 2000 is just they have no education whatsoever, and they're just, Neanderthals, and we can't believe anything that they could possibly say. They're so dumb they're barely able to function. And we're going to talk about that, modern day snobbery that we have as we look at people in the past. And we'll talk about that in a future episode. But the thing I want to focus on tonight is one of the mistakes that I find people making is that we tend to look at modern day standards for how we look at the world when we look back at something that occurred 2,000 years ago or 500 years ago or something like that. It's a huge mistake that you make, and it's so interesting when you have the opportunity to go back to places where history has happened. Someday I hope to go back to the Holy Land and actually see Israel and see the areas where all these biblical events occurred, and I haven't had that opportunity yet. But when you walk through places, even just here in America, where you walk through where the history has occurred, it's amazing to stand in the footsteps of the men and women who came before us, and to stand on a battlefield or to stand on the walls of maybe Fort Sumter in Charleston and look at where the Civil War began, or to walk the Freedom Trail in Boston and to look at all of those sites where our nation's history began in many ways. To stand at the site of the first shots fired in the Revolutionary War there in Lexington and Concord, and to stand there and look across that bridge and know that this is where the colonists really first faced off against the British in any large-scale form. And it's amazing to look at those things, and it gives you such a tremendous appreciation for history when you step back and look at those things through the eyes of the people who lived in that era. My dad's great aunt lived to be 99 years old, and I had an opportunity to get to know her. Grace was amazing. And, when we were sitting down when she had passed away in the early 90s, looking back on that, it was amazing to think that when she was born, the automobile had not replaced the horse and buggy. That she grew up in a time before the car, that she grew up in a time before the Wright brothers took their first flight. And not only did she get to live to see airplanes, but she got to live to see men walk on the moon. And it's just amazing when you think about all the things she had seen in her lifetime. When I look back at my two grandfathers, I think I've mentioned them before. One of my grandfathers fought in World War II in Korea, and he was a wealth of practical knowledge. And the number of things that he knew and could do around some things as simple as a garden all the way up to building some of the picture frames that hang behind me, to just all sorts of the most common practical knowledge. His general wisdom was just amazing. My other grandfather was a petroleum engineer. And as a hobby, he was an amateur astronomer. And you say, well, that's a very nice hobby. He was so good at this hobby that he actually taught astronomy as an adjunct faculty member at a Division I college. He was that good at it. When I look at the two of them, they were two of the smartest people I have ever known in my life. Neither one of them ever had a cell phone. Neither one of them could have ever told you the inner workings of a computer, the things that just drive our lives. And I think sometimes we think that we are so incredibly advanced. I think we spend half of our time serving the computers that we've created. It's remarkable how much technical knowledge we have, but in so many ways we've lost a lot of the practical knowledge that our forefathers had that brought us to this point. We took a trip last year to Tokyo, It was phenomenal. It was just amazing. But when I look at how that trip was successful and why we had so much fun, part of the reason why was that little cell phone that I carried around with between Google Maps and Google Translate and things like that. It made it easy. But I can't imagine doing that trip without some ability to be able to navigate the biggest city on earth. My children are just constantly amazed. We'll go on a road trip someplace and they're like, how did you possibly know where to go before GPS, before you had a cell phone? And it makes me feel like I'm 100 years old. It's, well, kids, we had these things called maps. And back in the day, we would haul out a map. And if you were really fancy, you went to AAA and you got these things called TripTiks. And it would be like these little detailed maps that were specialized when you were going through a town and you needed to turn from this highway onto that one. You had little maps, little fold out maps, and you could flip through them and it would tell you when you should turn. It was basically a paper version of the cell phones that we have today. That was amazing when I was growing up. But it's remarkable when we look at all of these things. And from my children's perspective, growing up without a cell phone is unimaginable. When we grew up, phones were on the wall, and I don't know that we ever had a dial phone that you actually went in and dialed each one. I always remember the push button phones being on the wall, but I can remember the first cell phones being these monstrous things that were hooked to oh my goodness, they were like yay big, and they really didn't work very well, and they were hooked up to a bag. It was a bag phone. You plugged it in your car, and you had a big antenna. And it's just remarkable when we look back at where technology has gone. But as we do that, whether it's my kids putting themselves in my shoes when I used to travel versus how they travel now, or whether we look back at something much more interesting and relevant to our discussion, what were things like 2,000 years ago? We have to step outside of what our expectations are. And when we ask the questions, well, were the Gospels written down soon enough after Jesus lived and died that they're reliable? How were things passed on before they were committed to writing? Once they were committed to writing, how were they passed on from generation to generation, and can we trust what we have? When we do that, we have to take ourselves out of the age where you sit yourself down on the sofa, you open up your laptop, you open up Microsoft Word, and you start typing. That's not the world that they grew up in. And so we have to jump into a very different era. And we have to ask ourselves, if the most important thing in the world had just happened to you, how would you spread that and what would you do? How would you preserve that knowledge? And so you immediately have to start peeling away the things that we consider to be important. So for the rest of tonight's podcast, let's jump into this question of what were things like 2,000 years ago? And how very different was it? So just for starters, we talked a lot about transportation tonight. Transportation, how far could you walk? I mean, don't get me wrong, there were horses and things like that. You probably couldn't afford one as a normal person. There were boats, as Paul recounts in the book of Acts, not always the most reliable things in the world. In fact, you had a good chance of ending up shipwrecked somewhere. Transportation meant putting on a very thin pair of sandals and walking. And roads were not great. There was no asphalt. There was no concrete. You walked. And while the Romans were building a system of roads, and that's going to become important when we talk later about the history of how the gospel spread and why maybe God chose the time that he did, but you walked as far as you could. And so maybe 10 miles, maybe 20 miles, somewhere in that range per day is as far as you could go. Now, as you think about the city that you live in, how far is it across the city that you live in? Could you even have walked there in ancient times 2,000 years ago from one side of town to the other? Something that takes, less than 30 minutes to drive today, maybe 15, 20 minutes, depending on what you're talking about. Could you have actually walked that in a day? Our daily commute for most of us is longer than people could have actually walked in an entire day, and most of us do it in a matter of minutes. So transportation, very, very different. And you're doing it in a world where, and I've mentioned this before, life is unimaginably cheap. Most of us have grown up in the West. Most of us have grown up in the Christian West several thousand years later after Jesus came and changed the world. what we can't begin to understand and appreciate is, what did it look like 2,000 years ago under Roman rule? Number one, you're probably a slave. And it's not slavery like what we think about before the Civil War. Slavery under Roman rule was very, very different. But you are subject to the state. The odds of you being a free person are very rare. Partially, we know this from historians throughout not only the Bible, but to non-biblical historians as well. But you see this in the book of Acts when Paul is arrested. One of the very first cards that he plays is, be careful, you can't torture a Roman citizen. And the Roman centurions immediately back off and go, oh, we didn't know you were a Roman. We didn't realize you were a citizen. And at one point, one of the Romans looks at him and says, I'm also a Roman citizen, and I paid a very high price to buy my freedom. And Paul tells them he was born free, basically. So Paul had come from a very wealthy family where he was born into that privilege. But odds are you're born under Roman rule. You're a slave of the Roman Empire. You have very few rights. And life is very cheap. You can be put to death for, pretty much anything. So life under Roman rule is incredibly cheap. Life is incredibly short. Your average lifespan, now granted, if you make it out of your early, childhood years, you have a decent chance of making it maybe into your 40s or 50s. The average lifespan is 25 to 30 years old, because so few, making it out of childhood is such a very difficult thing. Food is not stable. Medicine is not great. And so life is very cheap. Life is very short. And most people are focusing their time and their efforts on daily survival. Now, and again, this is going to be where we get into one of these things. Most people, and I've seen estimates as high as 90% of the population or so are illiterate. They don't read. Now, in our minds, we immediately make the connection. Oh, they're not very well educated. They're not very smart. They must be dumb people. And that's a wrong assumption to make. The reason 90% of the population is illiterate, up to 90% of the population is illiterate, is because the written word is very rare and tremendously expensive. The printing press is not going to be invented until the 1400s. So 14 centuries later, the price and the availability of the written word starts to come down dramatically. The price comes down, the availability goes up. During biblical times, 2,000 years ago, I saw a speaker one time talking about how expensive the written word was. And they speculated and went back and tried to figure out the book of Luke, Luke's gospel, would have potentially cost around $2,000 2,000 years ago when it was originally written. $2,000. And it's because every aspect up and down of the written word was very difficult to do. You didn't go to the store and buy paper. There was no paper. You wrote either, there were metal, you could engrave things on metal, you could write on animal skins, or you had papyrus. And one of those things, but even the form of writing was incredibly expensive. And then if you wanted a copy of a book, the book had to be copied by hand. It had to be written letter by hand and copied over. So the written word is very rare and very expensive. Your average person simply doesn't need it. When you look back in this culture and you see hints of this throughout Scripture, those of you who've looked at the Gospels at all, you'll see words mentioned of the Pharisees. One of the things the Pharisees had to do was to memorize the first 5 books of our modern day Bible. The first 5 books of the Old Testament is what we think about it. You had to memorize that word for word. So when we think about how oral tradition was passed on, one of the ways that this was done was the writings were so rare that you learned and memorized those written words, or you learned it verbally to a point where you had memorized it word for word. The first 5 books of the Bible. I have trouble memorizing just about anything anymore at this point in my life. It's amazing what they could do. But this is how knowledge and history and information were preserved and passed on. So the written word is incredibly rare, and most of the population, again, doesn't read or write. But it's not because they're uneducated. It's not because they aren't smart. It's because there wasn't really any need. You also live under Roman rule in this incredibly diverse melting pot is one of the words that we like to use of cultures that come together. During the time that Jesus lived, a lot of people believe he would have likely spoken Aramaic, but Greek would have also been a common language, and Hebrew in that area was also it was a dying language by that point, but it was also spoken, though, by the religious leadership. And so you had a great many people who were comfortable speaking in a great many different languages. Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark, who is considered to have written down Peter's remembrances of what happened, Mark was known for being Peter's translator. And so he was someone who could speak in many different languages. We don't know how many. But in this ancient world, in this ancient context, you would have had just this melting pot of all these different languages and cultures that were coming together on this system of Roman roads under Roman rule. And so you see all of that coming together. The Jewish people were desperately waiting for the Messiah. They were not waiting for Jesus. They were not waiting for who he was going to be. They believed that the Messiah, looking at some of the Old Testament prophecies, would be a conquering general who would defeat the Romans and establish a kingdom in Israel that would last for forever. They were not expecting the suffering Savior from Isaiah 53. And so when Jesus came, he turned everything on its head. But they knew from Daniel's prophecies from over 400 years before that this is when the Messiah should be coming, and they were ready for it. So Jesus walks on this scene in this incredible moment in history where the world is in this place under oppressive Roman rule, and the Jewish people are waiting for their freedom. And certain things are starting to change that are going to allow the gospel message to be spread throughout the area. But when we think about this and we do this, we have to remember the culture and the world that existed 2,000 years ago. When we look at these things and say, well, the Bible was probably committed to writing several decades after Jesus died, people go, oh my goodness. But when you think about it, that's faster than almost any other document, maybe any other document, major document that we think of in antiquity. Things were not committed to writing immediately. They were passed on orally. Many of the biographies that we have of Alexander the Great are written hundreds and hundreds of years after he passed away. And yet we know that Alexander the Great lived. We know that he was a real historical figure. So when we look at the time frames, we're going to have to take into consideration it was a very different time. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, how were things passed on? When Jesus lived and when he died, what was that next step in passing those things on orally? And then what was it that triggered the authors of the Gospels to sit down and go, yeah, the time has come. We need to get this stuff into writing. We are going to talk about all of that, but that's probably a good segue to wrap things up for this episode. I want to thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you can picture yourself, just sit down and think about what it would have been like 2,000 years ago to have walked during this time, and what things could they have, what would you have seen? What would you have been able to know and do differently? It's just something that's impossible for us to imagine, but we have to make a little bit of effort before we get there and really try to analyze the Gospels. So, thank you so much again for joining me this week. If you enjoyed this week's episode, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. You can find our podcast out on iTunes and Spotify. For those of you who are listening to our podcast, thank you so much for doing so. You can also find our podcast online on YouTube. You can find helpful information on our website at prooftograce.com, and you can reach out to us via email at prooftograce@yahoo.com if you've got any questions or comments. Thank you once again for joining us, and I hope to see you next time when we look at this question of how were things passed on through oral tradition in these ancient cultures. And I think what you're going to find is, unlike the telephone game, it's quite impressive. Thank you once again, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.